Hello, everyone. I'm Becca Owen. I'm the current guest curator at Five Oaks Museum. I use they, them pronouns, and we're here with Molly, who's one of the co-directors at Five Oaks. They also use they, them pronouns. So during our little brunch conversation today, we're going to discuss the creation and the curation of the Gender Euphoria exhibition for about half an hour. And then we're going to open up the conversation to everyone here and address any questions or thoughts that come up for folks during the conversation. So first, a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. You can turn on your video or you can leave it off. It's totally up to you, although I will say it is nice to see people's faces and feel like I'm not just talking at a bunch of black boxes. You will be muted by default. And we'll ask you to stay muted during our chat just because Zoom will like automatically go to the screen of whoever is making sound. So even if it's like your cat or like a trash truck outside, it'll go to your screen. And you won't, the video is being recorded, but you won't be recorded unless you do unmute yourself and say something, which you are invited and welcome to do at the end of our conversation when we do the sort of Q&A and invite some audience conversation towards the end. So a little bit more about the exhibition that we're talking about today. Gender Euphoria, Contemporary Art Beyond the Binary is the current exhibition at Five Oaks Museum. It just opened yesterday. And as a genderqueer, non-binary art historian and curator, it was like beyond exciting for me to have the opportunity to curate this show. It really has been a dream of mine to showcase all of the local talented trans and gender nonconforming artists in the Pacific Northwest region. And so I was so excited to bring together all of these artists and artworks for this show. The whole show is non-location based, so there's a website gallery, live stream programming and events like this one. So like Molly mentioned, we had an incredible opening night last night with a performance by Haley Tayafi. That's going to be posted on the website shortly. And then tomorrow there's a zine making workshop with Liberty Moree. So you can register for that, it's free. And then in August, we're gonna have a Queering the World workshop, although I like queering the workshop too. But Queering the World workshop with Lo Moran, who's also a featured artist, and you can also participate in their social practice project by visiting their website. So all of those events are up on Eventbrite, and I'll post the links to them in a little bit. And if you're in the Portland area, I also encourage you to participate in Zeph Fishlin's social practice project, Some of Its Parts. So that's a collaboratively authored photography project that envisions the future of gender. So I encourage you all to check out their webpage on our website and participate if you can. I also want to thank all of the exhibition sponsors. So thank you to the Imperial Sovereign Rose Court of Oregon, who are the Oregon's oldest LGBTQ+ organization, Rainbow Tax and Accounting, the Miller Foundation, and the Collins Foundation. Thank you all so much for believing in the importance of this work and for making space for conversations like this one. I am gonna send those links to the chat and turn things over to Molly, who's gonna read a body acknowledgement written by the Five Oaks Museum.
Thanks so much, Becca. So exciting. So yeah, the body acknowledgement is something that the museum created as a team sort of in response to this major shift. We had worked more in person than remotely before, so we felt that change. And we knew that that change was happening for a lot of folks. And so we thought about the sort of dislocation of that experience and wanted to have this way to kind of check in at the beginning of events like this. So before we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize the body. Each of us is one, and it is the body that holds us here in this shared world. I invite you to choose a physical sense and check in with it. Place a hand on your skin. Is it warm? Breathe in deeply through your nose. Can you smell? The context of a virtual meeting can feel disembodying, but actually a chain reaction of very rapid physical phenomena are what's connecting us through our senses. We're still doing the physical work of presence together, and our bodies deserve our attention and our care now and always. Other bodies, of course, deserve acknowledgement in the virtual and physical spaces we simultaneously occupy as well. The bodies who built and who maintain the structures and objects around us, the bodies who cannot access spaces like these, the bodies who were consumed, harmed, and killed in the places we now occupy, the bodies of the future who need us and whom we also need, and for whom we take on this work of healing, struggle, and change. Let's not forget those bodies while we continue to care for our own as we share this work today. And remember, our bodies should be comfortable. Our thoughts and feelings don't always have to be. So here we are in this virtual village together. Like Becca said, I'm Molly Alloy. I use they, them pronouns because I am a non-binary, queer, trans, human person. And I also have the great pleasure of being the co-director of the Five Oaks Museum with Nathaniel Andrini and our incredible team. That is something I've been in for a couple of years now, and I'll speak a little bit more about my experiences there. But let's get a little more intro from Becca.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I'm Becca Owen. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a non-binary and genderqueer art historian and curator. And I'm the current guest curator at Five Oaks Museum. And I guess I just wanted to speak to you a little bit about like how this exhibition ended up happening at Five Oaks. So I applied for a guest curatorship. They invite guest curators to have exhibitions, and then there's a sort of external panel who decides who's awarded the exhibition. And I had been dreaming about this project for a long time, but I didn't know what institution would be the right one to host it. And so I heard about the guest curatorship, and I went to the Five Oaks Museum website, and I was reading the sort of about page and the different staff profiles. And I saw Molly, and I saw that not only did everyone have their pronouns listed on the website, which many art institutions don't do that practice, but that Molly also used they, them pronouns. And I was like blown out of the water to see this museum director who was also trans and non-binary. And I just felt this like immediate sense of like, this could be the place where this show could happen. So I think, yeah, that just to the importance of having sort of visibility of trans folks in all institutions, and for me in art institutions.
So sweet. We were reflecting on this moment that we both remember so clearly when we were preparing for this talk, of like going around the table at the info session in advance of the guest curators making their proposals. And Becca came to one of the info sessions, and I was at the table, and it goes all the way around, and most people are not introducing with their pronouns, and Becca introduced themselves and introduced their pronouns. And it was a similar moment then for me that Becca created, where I was like, oh man, like now I get to know, I'm at the table with somebody who's broached the pronouns factor for me. I get excited, I get to share my pronouns to someone who's like, you know, in that journey with me. And that was the first time I'd been at a table in my capacity as museum director and had that experience. So it was really sweet. And then not being a decision maker about the exhibition, but having it be selected by the panelists was so incredibly validating, that this issue and this artwork and this community is like urgent and valuable to people even outside of just, you know, folks for whom it is our own identity. So that was just a really beautiful process. And Becca and I thought, you know, I could share a little bit about sort of my experience within the institution, because it is compelling, at least to us, to see this this phenomenon of having this sort of queering in the curatorial perspective and in the institutional perspective. And it was an interesting process how I came out as non-binary, or more so I came into myself as non-binary at the same time that this institution was going through really deep, significant change. And the two really happened in a lot of ways, like interrelatedly and sort of through the needs of my body and in my non-binariness. And for my health, I have an ongoing disease. And 2.5 years ago at the museum, I had the need to take some medical leave. I had a major surgery. And at the time, we were just dealing with a really challenging situation at the institution. I'll say in this safe crowd that we had an abuser as our leader. And we all were suffering in different ways and being treated to that in different ways. And I sort of stepped aside, and I had this personal experience and this like physical recovery experience. And it was like, for some reason, my body shifted in that healing process after that particular surgery, where it was just like an understanding that I didn't need to hold on to this sense of being female, and this sort of predetermined sense of my body. And as that was coming into my awareness as I was healing from this surgery, I was returning to work, and it was sort of like, you know how we say like your gut tells you when something's wrong, and it was like my guts were like, I can't handle something being wrong. I need everything I have for healing. And so my tolerance for the situation had just evaporated, and so we really started working to make it be known what was going on. And so it was like, looking back with my co-director sort of a few months later, after we did have this really unusual circumstance of successfully bringing a situation to light and having a totally different situation arise from it that empowered us to move forward, and build an institution with an approach of healing and based in our real values. And we reflected looking back and saying, oh, it's uncanny that sort of I was coming out at the same time that these things were happening in the institution. And then we're kind of like, well, it's not uncanny exactly, it's interrelated. The causation there is connected. And the binary, wherever you find it, is this oppressive, colonial, racist, patriarchal construct. And so it was like breaking that down on the intimate and institutional scale at the same time actually made a lot of sense. And that reflection sort of unlocked for us how each person in the institution could leverage their intimate experiences in similar ways, and that in fact the change we had collectively enacted was fueled by everybody's gut in that sense. And so what it's allowed us to do is actually move forward with that as an intentional way of thinking. And we really look for binaries in the structure of the institution and other vestiges of oppression, and look for creative ways that we can disrupt those things. So again, to see, you know, one of the major shifts that we made is sort of divesting the authority of the museum, and letting the curatorial voice be coming from community members. And so to see right away that, you know, this exhibition was selected and that Becca was uplifted to be one of the first curators to have that platform, you know, just incredibly like moving and validating for me, and I know for the whole team, that that work is manifest and is becoming real in those ways. So, you know, that's kind of my angle, and where it resonates so deeply with me personally, and where it resonates so much with our institution. But Becca, you know, tell us a little bit more about sort of this dream that you mentioned of finding a place to have this exhibition, and why this theme of every way you could possibly present non-binary work, and kind of what all does this theme hold for you?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Molly, for sharing that story, and really beautifully said. So the show consists of trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary artists. And I really felt this like urgent need to uplift like joy, vitality, and pleasure in these gender identities. I think so many mainstream narratives about being trans are often negative and violent. They're often told by non-trans people. And of course, there is just as urgent of an importance to like acknowledge the political reality of being trans, and that, you know, trans people do face violence. Like, these things are important, but I don't think those should be the only stories that are being told. And so for me, selecting the theme of gender euphoria kind of allowed me to pick artworks that were that we're expressing joy, that we're expressing pleasure, that we're expressing like all of the good things that we as trans people do feel in our gender identities, and telling these more complicated and multi-sided stories rather than just allowing the narrative of transness to be this singular monotonous story. Part of that project is definitely this goal of world making. So as an art historian, I've found that there's often like limits to our knowledge and holes in the archive, especially when it comes to genderqueer art and artists. So also thinking about this exhibition as a container that will like document and archive all of, or not all of, but many of the contemporary trans and gender nonconforming artists working in our region at the moment. And one of the questions that Molly and I sort of have talked about is like, are there any other trans museum directors? Like, is Molly the only one? And so also thinking about this show as a way to like build connections with people who are doing similar work, who are interested in similar types of art, and kind of creating this shared knowledge base.
Yeah, if y'all know any other trans or non-binary museum directors, like, hook me up.
Yeah, hit us up. And finally, one of the sort of guiding principles for the show was reflecting on how non-binary experiences are often left out of trans representation and discourse. The show does not exclusively feature non-binary artists, but there are many, many non-binary artists in the show. Which is often not the case for representation of trans people and discourse around what it means to be trans. And I think that norm is really harmful to non-binary and genderqueer people who don't see themselves represented, even as representation of what it means to be trans is kind of becoming more and more mainstream. And it also minimizes the understanding that cisgender people have about the multiplicity of trans identities. So if you are someone who's learning about what it means to be trans and you are only seeing binary trans people over and over and over again, you're going to have a very limited understanding of the reality of like very various and diverse gender identities that kind of fall under the trans or genderqueer label. So in that way, this exhibition benefits both the trans people who do see themselves reflected in the work, and also people who aren't part of that group who can have like a more multifaceted understanding of transgender identity. And with that, I wanted to talk about some of the themes of the exhibition. I'm going to share my screen and we'll do like a little curator's tour / walkthrough of the exhibition later. But before we get there, some of the kind of overarching themes that have emerged from this work for me include the bodies as a subject of work. So works that use positive representation, self-affirmation, and celebration of trans bodies. Artists who are mixing gendered signifiers in their work, artists who are using abstraction and ambiguity to represent the body, and also this idea of self-portraiture as like creating the self. There's also a theme of pleasure and sex in much of the work in the show, which I think has a sort of naturalizing effect on transsexuality. I think often bodies that are represented as sexual or desirable in mainstream culture do not include trans people, or on the reverse side, trans people are fetishized and objectified. So thinking about these really like positive self-determined representations of transsexuality and pleasure in the show was important to me. There's also a theme of friendship and community and love. So you'll see in many of the works explore intimacy, community support, kinship, and all of these things are really important for the survival of trans individuals and communities. And finally, there's this kind of like complex knot that I couldn't quite encapsulate in one word of history, world making, liminality, and assemblage. So many of the artists engage in retelling history, whether it be personal or otherwise, sort of taking parts of things and piecing them together to create new wholes, exploring themes of decay and entropy, and also utilizing collective imagination and collective creation in their work. So we'll go back to all of those themes later and look at them in relationship to specific works.
That's great. Thank you, Becca, for sharing. It's so nice to get just like a little situated in your thinking, sort of like unpacking this term gender euphoria. Maybe people have heard it, probably a lot of the people in this group, a lot of people haven't, but also to really sort of take it out of just being like a quippy sort of phrase and see like how much it takes within a body to get to that experience if your body's not conforming to sort of external expectations and stuff. And I think, you know, hearing you speak to these themes, it's just poignant at any time, but we find ourselves creating this exhibition in the middle of this very extraordinary time. It's not any time, right? It's like a really specific sort of like moment in history. And in particular, those themes just have such a strong resonance with the context of this beautiful uprising, the movement for Black lives being in this really charged, really active place right now. And I've seen this time in the movement more than I've personally experienced before, that people really are understanding more so and giving more attention to the intersection between the movement for Black lives and trans liberation. And so I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about how you've been, you know, affected by the backdrop and thinking about this exhibition in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. So the show was conceptualized and put together before the murder of George Floyd that sparked these kind of massive uprisings across our country. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement has been going on for many years before this. This exhibition was also conceptualized before COVID became a reality in all of our lives. So both of those things have really affected the show. Personally, as we were kind of preparing for the show to open, I felt really alarmed by the ways in which I saw things in regard to the movement for Black lives kind of going like back to normal. Like I saw people stop sharing content. I saw people stop posting. I saw kind of business returning to usual and people not prioritizing conversations around the movement for Black lives. And I really didn't want that to be the case for this exhibition. So the introductory statement that you'll see on the exhibition webpage really situates this exhibition opening in the contemporary moment and in the current context of the movement for Black lives. And I think we've noticed that there's really been like an increased criticality in audiences for all types of cultural production, for politics, for everything that's going on in our lives. And I wanted that to be acknowledged by the show as well. And for me personally, it helped me think about and understand and develop the connections between the movement for Black lives and the movement for trans liberation, and to really reflect on how these things, especially for many individuals, are intrinsically connected. So it definitely helped me sort of shift my thinking around the exhibition as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that aspect of increased criticality. That's a way in which like an accelerated movement around us can kind of like become a part of everybody's like daily thinking, is that you may be more cognizant of certain things. It's like Becca and I have reflected on how it's sort of not uncanny, right? Like the ways in which they and I demonstrate a very like closely adjacent kind of non-binary presentation, and there's lots of room in the world of what that looks like for people that we can't represent personally, that the exhibition can somewhat represent but very incompletely, and that actually it's kind of exciting to think that our audiences today, you know, differently from if the exhibition had opened 6 months ago, may actually be more aware of that, where it lacks to show the full picture, than they would have been before. And to think of audiences coming and being excited for what we've presented and also capable of seeing beyond what we've been able to present today to, you know, their dream of the next even more specific exhibition. They have to go find an institution, you know, that wants to show, and just this idea that there is a sense of progress in that to me. And we, you know, Becca mentioned, of course, also that there was a change for COVID too. So that even came before the movement around us accelerated in this way. And that had a huge impact on how the exhibition shifted, we thought it was going to have like a couch and that people were going to like sit close to each other and like read books and touch objects and stand in front of art. And, you know, truthfully, this week as the exhibition has like come into its reality, we have experienced some grief, the losses of those things that COVID does like reach into our lives still and does deny us certain things that would nourish us. But it allows me to see each of your living rooms, which is like incredibly intimate, and the kind of presence that people are holding in virtual space is really powerful. And one of the biggest reflections that we made, basically we knew everything was too unknown in the time frame of the exhibition. We had to make a decision very early on that we would let the physical manifestation go because we needed to know what we could achieve and focus our energy on that. And that reflecting on that need sort of demonstrated to us like that kind of tactic, that agility, the sort of underground nature of just responding to what's possible and finding a way to support your community and to be seen in who you are, regardless of the circumstances around you, is so queer, is so trans, is so non-binary, you know, is so liberated, is so like works, you know, so it was sort of letting that change be born out of the very experiences that we're trying to uplift. And I think, Becca, there's so many ways in which you built this virtual realm that like has this coding, all this sort of wonderful queer infrastructure to it. And we can get into that even more when we're in there really looking through.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the things that for me, the ability for us as this project has unfolded, I mean, since March, like it hasn't been super long in the development, but so many changes have happened since then. And so the ability for us to be nimble and to be tactile and to be responsive to everything that is happening around us also does feel like this sort of like adaptable element of queerness. Mm-hmm. So it's been really fun to embody that, not only in the content of the exhibition, but also like mm-hmm. in the process of its creation.
Yeah. Show us. Let's go see it.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen with y'all. Let's do that now.
So Becca, I know that when we get in there, you have these themes you're gonna, you know, expand upon and share with us some more. But I'd love, as like your sort of starting orientation, to tell us a little bit about like how you can like navigate it and sort of, you know, how is that enacting some of your like thoughtfulness in how you built it.
Absolutely. First of all, does this like look okay? The screen, can everyone see it? Is it too,
It's giving us like mobile view. Is that what you want?
It's just because my window is small. How's that?
Yeah, so if you want to show us like desktop view, you just got to make it wider.
Yeah. That's about as wide. Well, actually, I can make it wider. Hold on. We'll have a little moment, you guys.
Like Haley said, it wouldn't be a proper Zoom experience without a tiny bit of technical difficulties.
How's that for everyone?
Yeah, that did it.
Cool. So I'm just arranging all of my little windows here in virtual space.
Except unfortunately, it's not giving us the full width actually. Like almost, like we're right, there we go. That looks great.
If I make it full screen, then I lose access to my notes. So that's what I'm like navigating. Does that seem like full width to you?
That looks good.
Okay, cool.
That still looks good.
Okay, we're gonna go with that.
Okay.
Great. Okay. So one of the things that I feel really excited about with the transition to a virtual form is that we've been able to like expand the reach and the scope and the audience of the show. So I know that there are people in Chicago on this call right now, people in New York on this call right now, and that people anywhere in the world who have access to Wi-Fi can access this show and see it. And so for me, thinking about someone who maybe lives outside of an urban center, who is trans or non-binary, who wouldn't be able to see this show if it was an in-person show, being able to find this on the internet and access it no matter where they are is like a super powerful and really positive element of having the show be virtual.
And already such an important existing pathway to community building for trans and non-binary people.
Absolutely. So we're gonna walk through the exhibition. This is the sort of introductory text, which I hope you all will take a moment to read later on. All of our wonderful artists, some information about the events and social practice projects that are happening. And then we move into the image gallery. So the way that the show is set up is basically, if you click on any image in the show, it will take you to a full screen version of that image so you can kind of see it in more detail. Then you can use the back arrow to go back to the image gallery. And the images in the show page are not grouped by artists. They're grouped thematically and sort of in formal relationship with each other. But
they're curated.
They're curated, exactly. But if you would like to see all works by one artist, you can click on that artist's name. That will take you to their individual page. You can read their bio. You can see every work by them that's included in the show. You can still do the thing where you zoom in on each image individually, although it might take a second to load. And you can also read a statement by them about their work. That was something else that was really important to me when conceptualizing this show, is that I mean, I've noticed this as a trend in many museums. There's been sort of a move towards including more of the artist's works, like in a wall text or in a piece's caption. And I think it's really important that as art institutions, we're not just saying like, well, here's what I think about this work, but that we're also giving artists space to express themselves, not only with their artwork, but also with their reflective written statements about their own work. So each artist will have an artist statement included on their page as well.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Becca, and it's like, it's really resonant with Five Oaks sort of ways of operating. We didn't predetermine that Becca needed to set it up that way, but I do appreciate it. There's like an element of transparency to it so that your text is more obviously yours and synthesizing your impressions, and people can compare that with the artist's own words and get different angles. And I think that can really help folks to see their own interpretation can't be wrong, because it's not gonna be, there's already two represented that aren't exactly the same.
Right.
And I also want to say, I think that component of, you know, you scroll through this beautiful curated sort of like gallery, imagine like walking in and looking and taking in the whole show. And then if you just want to go right up to a piece and sort of bury yourself in it, it's like that moment in an exhibition when you stand up maybe closer to something. But this piece of being able to click and see all of someone's work with their text, that creates an experience that's totally unique to this virtual format.
Right.
That I don't know if you premeditated this, but it totally gives me like Tinder vibes. Like it's got this kind of like dating app energy, especially when you do consume the exhibition on a mobile device, where you're scrolling and you're seeing how they've created these aesthetic moments with their artworks, and you can like click and sort of go deeper, and you kind of might, you know, swipe past something that doesn't resonate with you as much and linger longer on something that does, and this experience of kind of discovery. And I think that also to me is just very queer and invokes a kind of like intimacy and like a self-determination for the viewer that I think is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I honestly had not thought very much about what the show would look like on a mobile phone until it was done. Like I'd spent like hours and hours in front of my laptop building it. And then after it was done, we were like, oh, let's see what it looks like on my iPhone. And I love that you can experience it in both ways. I think especially now so many people experience this type of content on their phone. So it was exciting to have these kind of two different views. And I love what you said, Molly, about this moment of clicking on an image being like getting closer to an artwork in a gallery. Like I was thinking a lot about how to take the elements of like seeing a show in person that I like, the elements of that I do like, and how to like recreate them on the website. And so one of those things is like when you step into an exhibition, you see multiple different images all at once. Like you're almost like flooded by all these different images, and they're all kind of small or far away, so you can't like see them all immediately, but you see these multiple images together. And so that's the experience that I wanted to create on this exhibition page, where we have these sort of smaller scale images of every work that's included in the show. But I also wanted people to be able to have those kind of individual moments where you step in front of a single work, you spend a long time looking at it, maybe you read the wall text or the caption next to the piece. And so that experience is kind of recreated by clicking on the image or by going to the artist's page. So I was thinking about those dynamics of exhibition viewing in person. And I wanted this main exhibition page to not be really like cluttered with text, to really just be images and a little bit of text in the same way that you would experience an exhibition in person. I also
I think that's so effective, the way that you organized it, and it becomes so significant that you're able to express the themes and your curatorial perspective through then the arrangements that you've created. It's not like they're in here alphabetically, you know, it's like you give me a side-by-side moment. Right now we're looking at a body next to a sort of almost dollhouse like construction, or these two. It sends my thoughts about this middle image of this house into a conversation about the body that I might not have so readily if I just sort of came across that image in isolation from the others.
Absolutely, yeah. That was definitely one of my goals, was to think about how image placement would, and I mean, I think that's what all curators do. We think about, you know, when you put two images next to each other, how do they tell a different story than if you saw them not next to each other? And how do you want to bring out the elements or the themes or the stories of the work by using image placement and selection? And so I sort of conceptualized.
Can you know moments where that's really like demonstrating some of the themes that you were speaking to?
Yeah. So I conceptualized each of these rows kind of as walls, and thought about, like, you know, two rows that you could see at the same time might be two connecting walls in an exhibition, where you could see both of those walls at the same time, but they were on separate walls. So thinking about the different themes in the show, the first one I spoke about is bodies, which I really sort of open the show with. This is a photograph by Rain called Glow and Stretch. So all of the works that they submitted for this are photographic self-portraits. And when I see their work, I think about how it embraces fatness, embraces Blackness, and embraces queerness through these positive self-representations, and this powerful assertion that people who inhabit these bodies that might be marginalized by the mainstream are beautiful and important and strong. And one of the other things that I love about Rain's work is that many of them are in these sort of domestic interior settings. It reminds me of selfies, which so many trans and genderqueer people take selfies and circulate them in various different formats, and how seeing another trans or genderqueer person can be so like life affirming in that context. So that's what I take from their work. Another artist whose work really deals with bodies is Ebenezer Galuzzo, and this is one of my favorite works by them. And so their work is a great example of artists who mix gendered signifiers. So we have the dildo, then we have these like work gloves with these press-on nails and these fishnet tights. So all of these different gendered signifiers coming together in one body. Are you guys having a sound like feedback thing, or is that just me? Just me. Okay, good. So yeah, mixing together all of these gendered signifiers that might be considered to fall on one side of the binary or another into this one body. And that's also reflected in Ebenezer's process. So they take these photographic self-portraits and then they manually add other elements to them. So in this one, you can see the gold paint and the gold stars. And Ebenezer writes about how this hybridizing additive process helps him find pride and acceptance in his trans identity. So thinking here about how the process might mimic some of the themes that are coming out in the work. Paul. There we go. Another theme that we talked about earlier is pleasure and sex. So one of my favorite works for this theme is Zeph Fishlin's Anthropomopolyology, Hankies and Zine. So Zeph created these, and I see them as a retort to this homophobic idea that queer sexuality is like unnatural, because they took 13 animals who all have like, quote, queer as fuck sexual practices, and created this hanky out of representations of all of them, which of course plays with the queer cruising hanky codes, so using different colors of hankies to signify different sexual practices that you might be interested in. And then to accompany the hankies, there's also a zine that Zeph created. What's going to happen if I click on this one? Great. So this describes each of these different animal characters that they have included in the hanky, and all of these different queer sexual practices that these animals engage in. So really taking back this idea that there's something like unnatural about queer sex. I would also say both of the artists who I just discussed, Rain and Ebenezer, also deal a lot with sexuality and pleasure in their work. The next theme I want to talk about is friendship, community, and love. So, nope, it's up. I'm gonna find this one. So this is Pace Taylor's Memory Fails a Flower. Pace, all of the works by Pace in this show are these really gorgeously rendered moments of intimacy between queer folks. And as Pace says about their own work, they think about creating these liminal worlds for queer intimacy to unfold in their works. And then I also wanted to point us towards Ursa Nufer Rodriguez's photography. This is the specific one I wanted to look at. So Ursa is non-binary, and then also has genderqueer subjects in their artwork. So this photograph in particular really captures this like euphoric moment of kinship. And then there's this also beautiful playing with these literal gender signifiers of these girl-boy necklaces, and kind of reversing people's expectations around gender for the subjects. And then the last theme I want to talk about is this history, world-making, liminality, assemblage theme. So I want to show Ingemar Hagenkeith's piece here, Denim Hides. Actually, if we go to their page, we'll get to see multiple views, which will be better. So this piece takes apart these recognizable objects, jeans, and rips them into pieces and puts them back together into something entirely different, which you could see as like a carpet or a rug, or as like a wall tapestry. And so this piece makes me think about, for so many trans and genderqueer people, when it comes to gender, like there's really a pleasure in like ripping apart social constructs, taking the pieces that we want, and like assembling them back together in our own identities. So I think the process of like piecing things out and putting them back together is super queer. And Ingemar talks about imagining somewhere beyond where we are in her statement, and that is kind of the purpose of their work. And finally, I want to talk about Raya Houston. And I want to talk about a specific one, this one. So Raya assembles archives of personal and Indigenous history in all of her work. So this piece has like these personal objects, like a love note from her first boyfriend, photographs, also some Indigenous, I believe they're Hopi sculptures. So creating these like little archival assemblages with all these different memorabilia that help like all these different pieces of her identity coming together into this work, and thinking about how all these different things play out together. And a lot of her work, some of her other pieces also really engage with like a sort of criticality of how history is told, and a sort of retelling of history as well. So there's more artists who I didn't get to talk about, and there's more works. You can read my curator statement at the bottom of the page, which talks about this kind of stuff even more. But those are the sort of main themes that I personally take from the exhibition.
Something that I think we just need to make sure to just like mention, and just my thoughts went to the component that we can't like look at in exactly the same way within the visual presentation of the exhibition, are the kind of expanded elements, this social practice work.
Right.
Some of those same artists you did discuss, but I was thinking about it as like, with regard to both the sort of queer approaches that we discussed and how needing to like change to fit the constraints of the circumstances around us, we saw and embraced as kind of a queer process, but also it keeps coming up in the work itself, like, and I'm just thinking about this missing element of like the physicality, like physical intimacy is indicated here in so many ways. Just looking at what's right in front of us, the intimacy of like gazing at yourself, the practice of drawing yourself, the intimacy that's indicated in paces, you know, intimate moments, like everybody's sort of dealing with that in different ways. And I think it's such a significant part of this exhibition to me, that you gave us not just indications of physical intimacy, but opportunities to actually have kinds of physical intimacy with the work through some of the programs, right, like the camera program, right, where there's like a mitigated touch and kind of a crowdsourcing of indications of people's experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that program, and then we can open up for questions from folks. So some of its parts is
I guess more so, just to clarify, Becca, I'd love to hear you sort of just reflect on how the inclusion of social practice work is like integrated in sort of your themes and the overall impact of the exhibition.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think thinking about kind of recreating gender euphoria through this exhibition, part of that is through image sharing, and part of that is through creating experiences that like literally connect us with other genderqueer people. And I was so excited when I received the proposal or the application submissions from Zeph and from Lo to do these social practice projects, because I was like, great, these artists have come up with these ways to connect us that I can just then share through this platform. So it was important to me to not just have, especially in the post-COVID context, it was important to me to not just have audiences looking at images, but to also have audiences have the opportunities to like engage with each other in a more hands-on and direct interpersonal way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, love that. So yeah, so reminding folks, right, that we're inviting people to either drop questions in the chat if that's more comfortable, and or go ahead and unmute and just throw them at us with your voices.
Yeah, we have one question in the chat that I'll read out, Molly. Yes. It says, how did you find these artists? Was there an open call for submissions, or did you seek them out individually? And if so, where did you first see your works? Great series of questions. There was an open call for submissions. The only limitations were that you needed to live in the Pacific Northwest, and that you needed to identify as trans, genderqueer, non-binary, any related identity. And so I don't remember, we probably received like 60 or 70 artist submissions, and then there's 12 artists included in the show. So it was an open call, it was free to apply, it was simple to apply. That was also really important for me when conceptualizing this show, is that I didn't want there to be institutional barriers between artists and their ability to be included in this show. I had originally conceptualized the show as like me inviting artists, and I quickly realized that was not the process that I wanted to use. I wanted it to be an open call. Some of the artists who did apply were already on my radar, were people who I already know. Not surprisingly, I have many friends who are trans and non-binary artists. So some of them were folks that I already knew. but many of them were folks that I didn't already know. If they were artists who were already on my radar, honestly, Instagram is like the main platform that I use for like viewing artists' work and connecting with artists. So there's like so many amazing creators sharing their work in so many ways. And Instagram is just one that works for me. So that's how I personally will find a lot of artists or will connect with artists. I think that was every part of that question. Yes. Rain says, I love the connection to dating apps. Yeah.
Well, while people are brewing up some more questions for you, Becca, I'd love to revisit this idea of like the adjacencies that you created within that main exhibition page. And
Sure.
if there's any place where you can just sort of like bring us into your thinking and just like why certain, you know, groupings were important to you.
Yeah, I can, let me share my screen again. And I mean, the process of, can y'all see my screen now?
Yeah.
Cool. The process of grouping the works was like, and creating the themes too, like happened well, but mostly after I had all these images in hand. So, and I think this also speaks to like the virtual element of this exhibition. So I basically like gathered all of the submitted works that I had accepted into like thumbnail images on my desktop. And then I dragged them around to create groupings and to like play with like, what does it look like to see these three next to each other? What does it look like when I take that one out? So this whole exhibition was created and manifested in this virtual manner. But that was a really like useful strategy that allowed me to play with groupings and pairings of images. I mean, with the first three images, I'm obviously thinking about bodies, different ways in which the body is represented, altered, made ambiguous or made neutral. In this second row, I really liked the formal relationship between all of these pieces. So thinking about this kind of like circular or like archway form that like is really evoked when you see all three of these pieces together.
Yeah, stuff like that is interesting to me because it's like a form isn't necessarily a theme, but it starts to make you think more deeply about like what that form might mean to each of those artists and then why would it be recurring sort
Yeah,
of naturally amongst this body of work. Yeah, that's cool.
absolutely. Yeah.
And
So
can you go back to, you just said something about neutral, like the body becoming neutral or something?
yeah. Yeah.
That's very interesting to me. What do you mean by that?
So Liberty talks about this in their work a lot, and I'll show more of theirs. They talk about how they find euphoria in making the representations of the body like ambiguous and like non-gendered, and for them that's a euphoric experience. So in this collage, I mean, we can see this sort of like fragmented body turned landscape. And then I would also say that's present in their zines as well, whether it's through the direct text, so really challenging the association that the viewer might have with this body and like being female or being a woman, happens throughout this zine, True Neutral, thinking about bodies breaking down into cells and cells being nothing. Again, this sort of theme of like entropy and the sort of dissolving of gender. And then I would
It's
also
so interesting because I think of neutral in some contexts as sort of a violent state that people claim, you know, not engaging actively like as an ally in a context or, you know, having a political stance or whatever it is. This is such an interesting take on neutrality as this really like empowered, charged, kind of like activated state.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about neutrality and gender. I won't share them all with you.
Look for our second talk.
Yeah, and you can see that in this zine too. So these depictions of bodies that are kind of ungendered or unsexed and that don't have like an immediate association with gender or sex when you see them.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
yeah, and that's a theme that I would say carries through the exhibition, but is especially present in Liberty's work. This was
Cool.
another.
Well, oh, go ahead. But I was just gonna say that it's noon now, so maybe, and I didn't see any more questions in the chat. So maybe Becca, if you want to kind of wrap up what you were thinking, and then I'd love to just say a sort of closing thing. And then, in fact, if there's a little bit of lingering, if a smaller group stays after for a few minutes that did still have questions, we can hang for a little bit longer.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's one more question in the chat that I'll answer, and then Molly, I'll turn things over to you to
Cool.
close out. So Forrest asked, what's your own history of curating / as an artist, and what brought you to curating? So I'm not an artist myself. I identify as an art historian. So I don't actually have a practice of making art myself. But I would say I started studying art history when I was in high school. And like, as soon as I had that opportunity, I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do with my life. And as soon as I kind of found out what a curator is and what they do, I was like, that's the work that I want to engage with. I really enjoy thinking about art, writing about art, talking with people about art, and being a curator and an art historian allows me to do those things that bring me so much pleasure.
Cool. That's a nice wrap up. Thank you for that question for us. And thank you, Becca. I mean, I just have to take a moment to say, like, beyond just how totally tickled I've been throughout this whole process, that to share resonance in our identities and, you know, such a deep personal connection to the work you've brought in, your degree of like rigor and thoughtfulness and organization and like enthusiasm throughout this project has been totally amazing. And just, you know, thank you for how deeply you went spending time in an unknown like setting of the website and with these artworks to like create something that's, you know, you had to learn so much to create something so thoughtful that we can skim through and it feels very easy and very I find, you know, nourishing to look through this work, which is just what we so desperately turn to the arts for, especially in difficult times. So I just really applaud you and thank you. And the same to everybody who's here today. It's like there is something, you know, I'm adjusting to this virtual realm. I'm a very analog person. I really like feed off of all your beautiful energies if we were in person together. But seeing your faces and your names and, you know, knowing that everybody's like carved out the 10,000 other webinars that you could have been at to be here for this, you know, feels really special and significant and close in another way. We wanted to make all of the programming for this exhibition free. Becca talked about access and, you know, we're always on our journey as Five Oaks Museum, how we can improve access. And so we're very excited to do that. And that feels really necessary, especially with urgent work and urgent times. But of course, we do still have costs to keep the museum going. So if anybody is able to, I would love to suggest maybe a $10 donation. And Becca put the link, it's the very last link in that beautiful long block of links. If anybody does feel able to sort of tip the museum for this program. And I'll say that those funds in part will be directed towards the creation of a component of this exhibition called Museum at Our Place. And we have one museum at our place right now, which is from our previous exhibition. This is Kalapuyan Land. And we'd like to develop another museum at our place just out of Gender Euphoria artworks. The museum at our place is a collection of yard signs, and any person, all of yourselves included, can access these yard signs. It's a sliding scale purchase, and create an exhibition literally at your place. If it's your neighborhood, if it's your apartment building, if it's like a collective body of people that's spread out over distance, if you want to stage a parade down your street, like it's a way for the work to go into physical spaces and into people's communities, and so we can have that more direct contact through the museum at our place. So that's my plug, and thank you all so much. Thank you, Becca, for your incredible work. So yeah, now we can sort of say goodbye to most of you, but we'll linger for a few minutes if there's anybody that wanted to hang back for the lobby banter.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you so much, Molly. You know that it's been such a pleasure for me to work with you and with Five Oaks. I've worked with many art institutions and have never had as positive of an experience as I've had working with you all. So thank you so much for making this the best it could be.
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you for saying so.
Bye,
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. Join us tomorrow for the zine making workshop, 1 p.m.
Bye, baby Lila. Good waving.